Carlos Ramirez, owner of NVS Audio in Roselle, New Jersey. I get a lot of questions on how and why we upgrade the factory grounds when we're doing our audio upgrades on Harleys and basically any vehicle that we work on that we add additional current draw to, like large amplifiers or lighting. We always upgrade the factory ground. The reason we do this is the factory electrical system on a motorcycle or a car is designed only to run the factory accessories. So then people get in the habit of grounding the amplifiers to the body. The issue is a lot of these bikes are designed to have 40 and 50 amps of current draw. You're installing an amplifier that has 100 amps of current draw and then ground it to the body, where the body's only providing 50 amps of supplied current, because that's what the factory electrical system was designed to run. So there's nothing wrong with grounding it to the body or the frame, but you have to upgrade the frame ground. Current goes from the battery to the frame through the factory ground. In a lot of these cases, in a lot of these cars, a lot of these motorcycles, it's an 8-gauge ground. So you're installing multiple amplifiers that pull 70, 80, 90 amps of current, and then everything's going back to the battery through the factory ground. You can't do that. So we don't like to remove the factory ground wire. I know some shops like to. We don't, because if the bike or the car ever has to go back to the dealership to get service, they take their measurements based on what the factory ground wire is and the factory ground point. So we'll run a 4-gauge or a 0-gauge ground from the battery to the body, to the frame. We'll leave the factory ground. That way, if the bike or the car has to ever go to the dealership and they have to do any kind of troubleshoot, all they have to do is remove our power wire from the battery, our ground wire from the battery, and then the electrical system is 100% back to factory. So we'll run a 0-gauge ground to the frame, which is good enough to run our equipment and all of the factory stuff, but we'll also leave the factory ground. That way, if the dealership needs to troubleshoot, they shouldn't have to figure out our wiring. They remove our power, our ground, the battery is back to factory, the factory power and ground are on the battery. They can troubleshoot the vehicle as if it was factory. Just makes it easier for them. One of the reasons we like running grounds to the frame and a sub fuse panel is every bike we work on, if there's 8 accessories installed on the bike, there's 8 ring terminals on the battery with 8 power wires. Don't do this. It makes it a nightmare for anybody to work on the bike, and it gets very confusing. So when you add 1 or 2 circuits, that's fine. Once you add more than that, run an 8-gauge wire off the battery to a sub fuse panel, put a fuse on it, and then run all the power wires there. You can add up, if you have 2 or 3 10-amp circuits, just use a 30-amp fuse and then tie all those together. It's safe. It'll be fine. The line is still protected. But nobody wants to work on a bike that has 8 ring terminals on the positive, 8 ring terminals on the negative, and a lot of these guys don't use red or black wire. So if one of the ring terminals move, you end up with a negative on a positive on the negative. The LEDs aren't working. It's just a headache. So if you're gonna, I plan on having every client for a long time. So I try and make it as easy as possible for myself, for the client, for anybody who works on the bike after me. If we put something on the positive, I like it to have a red boot on it or a red heat shrink. It's just easier to service. Anything with a black boot is negative. Anything with a red boot is positive. When we add power lines to the radio or take power from the radio, we go by the standard 12-volt wiring colors from automobiles. So if we run a constant wire from the battery, it's going to be either yellow or red. If we run a ground, it's going to be black. If we run a remote, it's going to be blue. It just makes it easier to troubleshoot. In our shop, if you see a red wire, it's probably switched accessory. But it just makes things easier, and you're not going to be the only one working on the bike, so just make it easier for everybody. So we upgrade every bike that we work on that gets more than 1 single amplifier. We do a frame ground, and it's either going to be a 4-gauge or it's going to be a 0-gauge. So if we're doing a 3000 on the bike, it's guaranteed that it's a 0-gauge. If we're doing a couple of 800s, it's going to be a 4-gauge. And it just makes everything easier. It lets the factory accessories on the bike work better. It lets the aftermarket accessories work better. And then it removes all those ring terminals from the battery. So the bike, I decided, since I get so many questions on this, I decided to do it live in real time. So we have a bike in the back that's getting, I think it's two 1200s in the fairing. So it's two 4-gauge powers, two 4-gauge grounds, upgrading the battery under the seat to a lithium. So we're doing a 0-gauge ground to the frame, and then we're doing a 0-gauge power to a 4-way mini A&L fuse block. It's going to be 4-gauge power to the front, two 4-gauge runs of power to the front, and then an auxiliary wire to run the accessory LED lighting, and anything else. The tender that's getting added to the bike for the lithium battery is going to be on the 3rd circuit, and the 4th circuit is going to be left open for anything that we add in the future. So we have a 0-gauge power run from the positive to the fuse block. We have a 0-gauge power run from the battery to the frame, and then we have all our 4-gauge grounds grounded to the frame at the same point that we grounded the battery. Our connections are crimped with a hydraulic crimper and then soldered, and then everything is tested taped, and then we apply a red boot to the positive side and a black boot to the negative side, so they're clearly identifiable at the battery. All the wiring, of course, is oxygen-free copper wiring. For this install, we're using Stinger. So if you notice here on Ephraim's bike, we have the factory on top, factory ground wire, and then underneath we have our 0-gauge. And then there's our 0-gauge power, and underneath there's the factory connector. So there's only 2 connectors on the power side, 2 connectors on the ground side. And from the power side, it goes to our fuse distribution block, which distributes all the power. And the 0-gauge ground goes over here to the body. So you can see right there, that shiny nut right there. So all the grounding is done there. So our amps are grounded there. The 0-gauge from the battery is grounded there. So the bike gets more ground for the entire bike. So the bike is happy. And then instead of having 9 connectors at the battery, everything's at the factory ground. And then the factory ground has been upgraded to a 0-gauge, so now it can pass enough current to support it. So even if you're not doing audio, upgrading the factory ground's a good idea. So that was Ephraim's bike we just showed you. So here's Matt's bike right next to it. Same thing, Braille battery. There's the power, there's the 0-gauge ground, and there is the factory ground upgraded. So as you can see, there is 3 ring terminals. This bike is running big power, so we run a 0-gauge from the battery, and then all the amplifier grounds are ran to the upgraded ground on the frame. There's our hardened bolts. Nice and easy. All these bikes are done the same way. This bike's only running 2 Sound Digital 800s, and we still upgraded the ground. There's our 4-gauge. There's the grounding point tucked neatly down there, and here's the other side of the bolt right there. So our favorite wire to use is the Pro Series or the HPM Series from Stinger. Oxygen-free copper. This is 0-gauge. So the perfect length is 11 to 12 inches. And I'm going to show you why. So you want to go, there's a factory hole there already, that's why we use that. There's a matching one on the other side. So we clean the paint on both sides. And then the reason this is the perfect length is you want to be able to feed the wire through there. And you have to put a ring terminal on it. So if you feed it through that way, 0-gauge wire, it's kind of hard to twist. So you want to be able to bring it around. And it reaches there perfectly, and it reaches down there perfectly. And that's why you want it to be about 12 inches. Because if you make it shorter, it's going to be hard to make that bend, and the wire's going to want to straighten out on you. So So we're gonna go ahead and crimp and solder terminals on both ends. So we crimp every connector with our 10,000-pound hydraulic crimper. We crimp every single 4 gauge and 0 gauge this way. I had to build a new hydraulic press because Saul wouldn't let me take my old one from the old shop. Perfect crimp every single time. Now we're going to go ahead and fill that with solder. That connection is never, ever, ever coming apart. All right, this bike's not done yet, so we're gonna go ahead and do this one. This is the factory hole. That's where you want to ground it. You want to clean the paint on both sides. And you'll know it's the right hole because it's right above the factory ground. If you come around to this side, you can see there's the factory ground right there. And the hole's right above it. Let's see if you can take a peek, see it right through there. There it is. You want to go in that hole right there. That one. So on this side, it's right there. So it's grounded to the frame right where the factory ground is. You can see the factory ground right there. There's the grounding kit we use right there. As you can see, we have a couple of them. You shop owners, I recommend you definitely get it. You regular garage do-it-yourselfers, I don't know if it's worth the investment because this kit's like 150 bucks. This is the way the kit comes. That's the way the ground should look. What's nice about this wire brush is it's got a pin in the center. So when you do it right, it takes away just enough paint to cover the ring terminal area. That's everything that comes in the kit. Drill bit that won't let you go too deep, only drills 1/4 inch. Then these are special bolts. They're thread cutting if you go into a strut tower, but it also comes with nuts and washers, so you can nut and bolt it together. That's the way we like to do it. And then the anti-corrosion gel. Even comes with a nut driver for your impact gun. All right, you can see it there. Now let's hit the other side. There it is. Paint is clean on both sides. The bolt that we use is a 5/16, so you got to open it up a little bit with a uni-bit. Just a little bit so the bolt can pass through freely. There you go. Now we can stack the ring terminals on the other side. So this bike's getting 2 amplifiers. So those are 2 4-gauge runs. They go to the front. And our 0-gauge upgraded ground, which is right here. So all 3 rings are going on that bolt. And now we have our nice tight monster 0-gauge ground to the frame. And there's the other end, reaches perfectly to the battery. So there's the factory ground, there's our ground. Our amplifiers are grounded to the frame ground through this 0-gauge right down there. See that? And there's our power runs going to the distribution block. And there's the 0-gauge feed feeding the distribution block.